Today we're going to actually start, we're going to first approve the minutes. We're going to go through some of that and see if there's any corrections we need to do there. And then we're going to move on to talking about what our tasks are at hand, what our challenges, and and start actually moving into groups. So hopefully we'll be able to set up some good work groups today is what I'm hoping we get at the end of this. At least set some steps for moving forward and some deadlines for getting some of the future work done. So I welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. Let's get to the minutes because I know there were a couple corrections. Susan Gates, I know, sent us something with a correction. Anybody else have corrections that they want? Yes. Nancy?
I want to not be a pest and thank Susan for her attempt to try to synthesize what we said, but I think what appeared is not an accurate reflection of what I was trying to say.
Okay.
It's, the last says, and I kind of rewrote it and now I discover I didn't bring it, that the early childhood professionals are recognized for the professionals they are. Mm-hmm. I'd like to change that the professional preparation of early childhood people be improved.
Okay.
I actually rewrote it and I didn't realize I didn't bring it. May I just send that to you?
And
Okay.
Rachel's taking notes too, so she can take your words
I made a
down.
distinction between the noun professional and the adjective professional.
Okay.
And professionals, they have a professional demeanor. I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying they're not professionally degreed, and I think we need to improve. I mean, the 0 to 3 workforce is not generally as well prepared as they need to be.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Tracy.
Just a new spelling correction on the first, there's just no E.
Okay. Any other?
Rachel, have you got those?
Any other corrections or thoughts on the minutes? You want a few minutes to look real quick, or is everybody okay? Okay. All right, then we'll move forward on that. So we'll get Rachel to make those corrections, and we'll get those out. Does that sound good? Okay, thank you. Yes.
Should we move then to accept them as minutes as corrected?
We can, yep, we can do that.
So
Move. All right, thank you. All right. So the next part, I'm gonna, Susan and I are just gonna go over, I'm gonna go over some of the charge and some of the themes that we put around the room. And then Susan's gonna cover some of the things from the last meeting just to kind of bring us up to speed, all right? So just to remind everybody that our charge is establishing a vision and accountability for a birth through grade 3 system of early education that addresses all of the following: standards and assessment, data-driven improvement and outcomes, including shared accountability measures such as the NC pathways to grade level reading, teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness, instruction and environment, transitions and continuity, family engagement, and governance and funding. All right, so just to, we need to kind of stay focused on what our charge is and what we need to pay attention to. So.
Okay, and then we thought it would be helpful, as Pam and I were planning for the agenda, to kind of walk through some of just the high level, like solidify what did we do last meeting and sort of set the stage for our next piece of work. So we put together a little bit of a little presentation you have in front of you, and people in the audience, I put some extras out there for you. So just as a reminder, I'm just gonna walk through the slides. We talked a lot about early brain development and how it sets the stage for all future learning. I'm not going to read these. We did talk about the impact, I'm on the next slide now, of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and the reason that's important, it led to considerable conversation about, really how do we mitigate trauma and adverse childhood experiences in the context of the educational setting, but also within families and within communities. We talked about some of the potential negative effects of trauma and ACEs, which include, I'm on now the fourth slide, decreased intellectual functioning, decreased reading ability, lower grade point average, more days of school absence, and decreased rate of graduation. So just noting how important it is that we're addressing very vulnerable populations. And then on the third page, we started to move into why are we focusing, why do we have a birth to third grade council? And we talked about that really critical transition from when children go from learning to read to reading to learn at the end of third grade, and why that's just so foundational for all future learning. And we also know that end of third grade reading success is one of the single biggest predictors of high school graduation and later success in life. And then on the fourth page, we talked a little bit about what a birth to third grade framework might help us do. And that includes develop a continuum of service and recognize sort of whole child, whole family development. And then we did talk, as Pam reiterated, about the charge, and I've just put that in the slide deck again for you. I'm going to move past those, but when we start to do our voting, these might be helpful for you, the next few sets of slides, because they remind you what we mean by standards and assessment, what we mean by data-driven improvements, etc. So they're there on pages 5, 6, and 7, and 8, and really where I want to go is to page 8, which is the key discussion point. So you all reviewed the minutes, but just at a high level to kind of remind ourselves of the conversation that we shared. We really talked a lot at the meeting and had really considerable debate, and I think that's why Pam's reminded us of what is our charge for this council. We had a lot of conversation about the fact that we knew that children's success by the end of third grade was not going to only be impacted about what happened within the school walls or the child care program walls. And so that we needed to consider that as we did our work. We also talked about that we needed to think not just about cognitive development, but about health and about social emotional development, that they all impacted each other. We noted, and you all made a number of comments about how different the birth through 5 and K-3 systems are, that even our presentations were different presentations because the standards are different, the funding is different, the accountability is different, the expectations of children and families is different. And I think Senator Lee really eloquently talked about, and other people echoed that, Sharon, when you talked about transitions, as did Senator Barefoot, just how difficult the systems are to navigate within the system itself, so-called system of birth to 5, and within K-12 system, much less between the two. That those were, we didn't have a good structure in place to really make it accessible for children and families to understand how the system works and how they interact within it. And then lastly, I'm on page 9 now. We had some conversation about needing to think carefully about the role of government and the public sector relative to the private sector as we made recommendations and did our work, recognizing in particular that in the birth to 5 space, much of early childhood programs are private businesses, which is different than the K-12 system. And then Senator Barefoot reminded us that we should be willing to think outside the box and not just assume that what we have is what is, and we have to work just around the edges of what we already have. And other Tracy, I think you talked about how there's other bodies that are happening, including in Senator Behringer's House Bill 630, the Child Wellbeing Transformation Council that's going to look at the needs of children birth to 8, and the Governor's Early Childhood Advisory Council, and that we needed to be considering what they were doing and making sure that we were aligning and that those things were complementary. And definitely a lot of conversation about the importance of the people in the system, the workforce itself, how we develop it, to your point, Nancy, how we develop it, how we help with professional preparation and ongoing professional development of the workforce. So those were what I took out. I pulled from the minutes in the conversation, but if there's other things people think are missing, yes, ma'am.
On page 2, I just want to talk about, on the second slide, the first bullet. The wording of that is hard for me to deal with. I think that it takes us down a rather dangerous pathway, and I'd rather it say something like decreased ability to optimize learning environments kind of thing, because this just is a whole other thing.
Where are you?
On page 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Second slide, on the bottom slide, first bullet.
Decreased intellectual
yeah.
functioning. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I just pulled
that
that
is
right from
not
the
a-
presentation, but what, so what do you think would
I
be
think it should be
appropriate?
decreased ability to optimize learning
Okay,
environments.
okay. To optimize
Learning environments.
learning.
Because I think that suggests something that we actually don't know and takes us down a
Okay,
weird pathway.
understood, completely.
Okay.
Any other comments or points you want to highlight from the last discussion that you think was missed, or? That's a good summary? Okay, great.
All right, thanks. We're gonna move on to the next part where we're gonna really start thinking about prioritizing our work and moving forward. What Susan had pointed out on pages 5, what is it, pages 5 through?
8, I think.
8, yep, thanks. Pages 5 through 8, on each one, if you look around the room, there's paper up with the standards, with the 7, I call them the buckets that we're like addressing. And so Susan's handing out dots. Everybody's gonna get 10 dots. And the buckets that are described on pages 5 through 8 in the handout are up on the wall. And what we're gonna ask you to do is go around and put your dots wherever you think we should prioritize the work. So that means you can put all the dots in one bucket, or you can spread them out. It's up to you. But we just thought that would be a good way to just kind of see where we should start to begin focusing our work.
So the
Again, if
colors
you're-
don't mean anything, it's just the
No.
number.
And now the colors.
Colors don't mean anything, it's just, you can put all of them on one area, half of them on one, whatever you wanna do, or you can spread them out, all right? So, and like again, I said, if, Susan had in the handout the examples, or what each one of those areas means. So you guys can get up, we're gonna give you guys some time to do that, all right? And then once you.
Man, that's not an easy task.
What?
I said, that's not an easy.
Well, remember, I did ask you to think about which buckets you wanted to,
and
I
I
gave you a
did.
little bit of homework for today's meeting, so think about which buckets you think are the important ones to focus on first. I thought it was just, I have a copy.
Do you have a copy of it? I can't. Data driven and transition. All right, so I'll take hers. I'll put 5 up on each of them.
I just got handed one. Sorry.
I'm gonna run out as I got blinking at dots.
We're doing it.
that I've enjoyed.
Oh, thank
Time
you.
sharing your personal, because in truth, that's often hard to do, but to do it, but you guys.
Some of those concerns.
Chair
Are
actually,
there,
but, so have been on
let's do markers, we can add.
lists recently came off. Lucy Daniels board, I don't know if you're familiar with those two. But, so I've learned a lot more. But I've developed a great sense of need
My
for
wife learned a long time ago,
groups, so that's
if it involved
appreciated it so
a
much.
hammer,
I'm sorry?
Both my children live in your area, so,
okay.
so,
those plumbing jobs,
well, Smart Start has done a lot to improve.
Well, he'll do.
But even then, children get missed. So literally happened on one, and, you know, discovered, know that an individual could refer a child.
try anything and I'll screw up most of it.
No,
It's
it either,
interesting.
because I'm calling around and saying, who can I get to look at this child and refer? Who can refer? Me? What do I have to do do that? So I call CDSA, and sure enough. And truth be known, it in some respects saved that child's life, because he was being missed. And he will probably.
Okay.
A little assistance.
We were all here.
I think this is
Good experience on
pretty, the numbers are pretty tight on some of them. We got, data-driven is 28, teacher and administration preparation and effectiveness is 27, transitions and continuity we have 21, and governance and funding 19. The other one's much, much lower. Family engagement 6, instruction environment 8, standards and assessment 7. We've got 4 big buckets, actually.
So let's have a little conversation about why you picked the areas that you picked. And let's start with the top 3. Because one of the things we have to decide is how many buckets do we realistically think that we can work on? And Pam and I feel pretty certain that we should not work on 7. that is our strong preference.
Done that, but
And we were actually also going to take governance and funding and split out governance and funding. So we meant to do that and we forgot to do that. But
I mean, make it 2.
make it 2 separate ones. So let's just start with the top 3 getters, which are data-driven improvement, teacher preparation, and transitions. Why did you prioritize those for those of you who did? Somebody put dots up there.
what was the thinking behind the data-driven improvements? What are the things you're thinking of that you'd like to see, with your thoughts about putting, the focus on that?
Well, what measured, you do what gets measured, right? And so I think we need to be looking at, one, are we measuring the right things? I think there's been a lot of work, and a lot of us in the room can say maybe not. And so then it's what should we be measuring? How do we measure that? And then most significantly, how are we using that information to actually drive what's happening really across all of these areas, right? How does it inform what we're doing in teacher prep across the board? How is it informing instruction? How is it informing the services that we're providing? Because we'll have a much better sense of what it is that is leading to the outcomes we're seeing.
Okay. So what does that mean? Like, how do we? I'm just
sure.
trying to facilitate, But so we know that that people are trying to measure things out there. So how do we? What do you think the steps are to make the next decisions? And this is. I mean, I'm not trying to put Tracy on the spot. I mean, for anybody. So what? Yeah, Representative Horn.
Well, based on your description, what you just said, and reflecting on it, it seems to me data-driven improvements, that includes measurement, that gets over to standards and assessments, that those two might actually be combined. Maybe not, but that's just what occurred to me when you, because I wasn't sure what you meant by data-driven improvements, other than we want to make decisions based on good data. Well, to me, that's a given. Of course we want to make decisions based on good data. What kind of decisions? And if you're talking about measurement, well, that's what standards and assessments do.
Right.
Set the goal and provide the measuring stick. Have I lost control of myself?
Can I add something? Because I think that Representative Horn, that the distinction might be around standards and assessments are mostly related to assessing children. And the data-driven improvement is around how we as a system make improvements to the work that we're doing. Of course, it all does get back to how children are doing individually, but I think that the data-driven improvement is really about the systems that are working, not the individual children. Does that help?
Yeah,
Can I add, oh,
I would just build on what Cindy is saying in that I think that data-driven improvement gives us more population level information that we can then also disaggregate by groups to really understand populations that might be needing particular attention, different strategies. Standards and assessment, I think, tend to get us to, as Cindy was saying, like, what is it that each individual child should be able to know and do, and how are we gonna tell if they're doing them? Whereas the measurements might help us understand why aren't they meeting some of those standards and assessments? What are some of the key things we know influence their outcomes on standards and
So
assessments?
Tracy, why don't you give a couple of examples of what you
Sure.
mean by that, just to make it concrete?
So I can only speak to the work we've been doing through Pathways that has brought together lots of folks to look at what should we be measuring that impacts their grade reading. And they've done that through a whole child perspective to say, okay, if we want to get to more children reading by the end of third grade, the research is showing that children need certain things, right? They need health and development, they need families and supportive communities, and they need high quality learning environments, right? And so then what does that look like? And there's research that goes out to say, for example, it can go back to whether there's healthy birth weight is one factor. That may not be one we take up, but as an example, healthy birth weight actually impacts their future ability, their future likelihood of third grade reading. And if you really want to tell that story, then you look and you actually disaggregate the data and you see, wow, African American babies are so disproportionately affected by that. So our strategies might need to really hone in on that population. That may not be the best because it's birth weight example, but it's really to show what is it that we've already done a lot of research on what moves the needle for kids and where they need to be, sort of their milestones to get to third grade reading. We don't collect all that data. We don't have all of that data. We collected a lot of things that we don't necessarily need.
No, I think that's a great point. I don't mean to cut you off or anything, but
sure.
I think what you're saying is really important. And I think it's what we need to then know is what we are doing. What we are doing, is it making changes? Is the work that we keep doing over and over and over again actually creating good outcomes? And if we're not, then it gets back to what are we measuring? What do we do? And really going back to me, I mean, that's what because we know that there's a lot of work going on out there, but what is it doing?
So I think this gives us an opportunity to build on two major DPI efforts. And number one is the KEA formative assessment, because that addresses the whole child. It looks at progressions. It looks at, it gives us the kinds of information that we're not getting from the benchmark kinds of testing. And, years and years of hard work have gone into that. So we want to make sure to optimize that. And then a few years ago,
Sharon,
there.
I just
Yes.
just on that note, I think that was Representative Horn, part of your point is the overlap between the two.
right.
So the kindergarten
Right.
entry assessment.
Because that
and
is data, big
data-driven
time.
improvement.
Yes.
It's just, it could
Okay,
be
thank
one
you.
component
Right.
of it. Okay, go on, I'm sorry.
And then it was 2 or 3 years ago that there was a great effort to look into a repertoire of measures, to really analyze them for the value that they have for providing information. And I don't remember the outcome of that, but I know that really a lot of people put time and energy into that, and to find that information and use it, because it was a big effort. So those were 2 big DPI efforts that we really want to maximize.
Thank you. Yes, Kim?
When I put my dots on, when I'm looking at standards and assessments, I'm thinking of it from the standpoint of the childcare provider. And, you know, I feel it's important that we review the standards and the assessments of childcare centers, not particularly the individual children, but, you know, the way the rated license works and what tools we use to determine that. You know, the system is 20 years old now or thereabouts, and it hasn't changed much. I think it's time that we do an evaluation of the current rated license system, and I thought that fell under standards and assessments.
I may be looking at this, maybe I missed the boat. I mean, I read what's in here, but there's something in my head that says our data collection is a little bit fragmented. A lot of data collection going on, a lot of it not being used, but no consistency and collaboration or even knowledge of all those different data collection systems and how the collective data could be used. Maybe I know there's a lot of data being collected, a lot of it about children. I didn't want to put much on standards and assessment because I think we're doing a lot on that, but I don't think we're doing much on the things Kevin mentioned or even about where all the children are. And I'm particularly concerned about the very youngest children. So maybe I'm just missing the boat on what that whole thing was about. But
think I hear you
until
saying
we
that-
know it all, until we know what all they are, how can we really use it well?
We need to know all the pieces
All the
in
pieces,
order to
right.
be able to say where,
It's a huge
what we
puzzle.
need to be able to do with it.
And that is, I agree, I saw it the same way as Kevin saw it, and when I talked to my folks about back home about these priorities, one of the top priorities for my group was about standards and assessment, but it was focused on the classroom and how to Head Start standards compared to a local private provider. How can they be similar? How can we connect that? There was a lot of mention of the Foundations for North Carolina Foundations for Early Learning and those. So I was looking at it in that very specific way as well.
So I think one of the things that I'm hearing that's coming out of this conversation is we're having a very high level conversation about these 7 priorities, and there's a lot that they could mean, right? So what data driven improvement could mean. And if you look on page 5 at what it says use quality data. And so part of, I think, the query is, do we have quality data, and is it all in one place, or is it fragmented? To inform effective implementation of strategies to support development and learning, as well as using data to measure progress for children. So I think we're solid that one measure is looking at the kindergarten entry assessment, and that is really looking at a child level data-driven outcomes. But then the question is, when we say data-driven improvements to what data, about what? You're saying you were thinking in terms of the framework of early childhood standards and law rules and so on. There's other things we could think about in data-driven improvement. So we'll have to get, when we get a work group established, we'll have to get more solid on what are going to be our priorities within data-driven improvement, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Can I just add something, which, I think that's why the data piece in many ways drives those other pieces, because you wanna identify what is it, what are you making your standards move towards, and assessment move towards in some ways. And I think the other point that's worth noting, particularly in this type of council, is that the type of data collected for children birth to 5 is very different than the type of data collected. Forget about just being disjointed, it's just like do they suddenly change when they get to kindergarten that we don't need some of that other data we collect when they're younger, and vice versa?
I think we have an avenue in place because we have the data work of the NC pathways in action. We clearly have the grade level reading piece ready, but what happens in between those two is an opportunity for this group to look at, did that child attend a child care center? Were they in a pre-K classroom? Were they at Head Start? Was it an NC pre-K versus another pre-K? What happens in kindergarten, first and second grade, then looking at their M-class reading data, which actually filters up to the third grade reading. So I think we are sandwiched in the middle between the data that is representative of the NC pathways and the grade level reading. So there are wide open opportunities that are set in place, ready for us to take advantage of.
And I think that it may also give us the opportunity to look at the alignment or lack thereof of current practices in gathering data and effective teaching practices. And I am more at the K-3 level now with the amount of, you have to pull these kids, it's gonna take 2 weeks away from instruction for you to get these benchmark data. And then you're gonna do it again, 5 weeks later, and teachers, huge frustration with the amount of time they spend testing instead of teaching. So I think this alignment of process and what it is we would like to have happen for kids is big.
Okay.
Susan and Pam, I did not put a lot of my dots over there on data-driven improvement, not because I don't think it's important, but I think there's already a lot of work going on in that arena, especially with the pathways. And so I reserved my dots for places where I thought we maybe could spend more time in areas where you're not doing as much, such as family support. I think that's, clearly I'm probably a minority among the group, but I think that what we've learned through Smart Start and working in communities and also with the Race to the Top transformation zone work, to the extent you have families engaged and involved, you're going to get a much better product, you're going to get much more involvement from families, much more support. So that's the reason of course, that will not be one that we prioritize. And it's, in some ways, it's hard for me to see, to pick a priority because these are also interrelated.
Yeah.
It's hard to
They are.
say this one is more important than that one.
Right.
But I think to Sharon's point, if we can focus a little bit more on the transitions and continuity between what's going on in that early childhood space and the K-3 space, that would be an important. So I put my other spare dots on that one, thinking about how do we bridge that gap between what happens in the early childhood space and the K-3 space. And let me just add, not only bridging between kindergarten, pre-K and kindergarten, but making sure we have good transitions from kindergarten to first to second.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think, just because people put it doesn't mean that one's less important than the other. I think it's really about where do we start, and it's like building that foundation. So, do we start there? Do we start somewhere else? So I don't think doesn't think families aren't important. I think that we all know that is really the foundation of young children.
So I was thinking that where we would start was where we had the least amount of energy right now. I think we have a lot of energy around data-driven improvement. We need to lift that up. But a lot of work is already going on. So that's how I was thinking in terms of prioritizing. Where do we need to put more attention?
I think it's about all. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think part of the conceptual issue about the data-driven, so I will just say, it is a big thrust of the legislative intent. It specifically calls for this council to work on on longitudinal data and accountability. It is separate and apart from the 7 areas. It's called out as a overarching responsibility. And I think my sense is that part of the issue and the conversation that I think we've had at various times is there are a lot of efforts around data-driven accountability. The question is, what are what are the things we're really gonna focus on in terms of data-driven accountability? What data, what outcomes are we really gonna focus on? Because even the pathways work, which is incredible work, has how many potential outcomes?
It has 15 in the like top level, but then it has influencers that go out to probably 50.
50. So part of it is a prioritization process, which the pathways work is kind of starting to go through. But second of all, it's about who owns the responsibility for the outcome, the prioritized outcomes, and for measuring them and following them, and is responsible for that really helping to move the needle. Who is responsible? And I think that's part of the intent, is to say, you council are responsible for identifying the priority outcomes in our our birth through third grade space, and helping to move the needle.
And I think it's also important to look at the data that we are getting. I mean, we get a lot of data, but some of it's not outcomes. Some of it's just a lot of outputs. We have a lot of people doing a lot of things, but it's not necessarily moving the needle. So I think when I think of data-driven improvements, I'm like, how are we gonna improve the data that we are gathering right now? Because some of it is not what we need it to be. So we need to, from my perspective, we need to dig deeper and strengthen that piece of it for the improvement. I think it's a lot of the same thing that's been going on, I think, like Kevin said, for 20 years. So what are we gonna do to get a little bit better data on, and get a better return on our investment, for children? So I think that data improvement and digging down deeper, I look at it a little bit differently than just, we got all this data, that's great, we don't need to collect any more data, we just need to organize it. But some of that data, from my perspective and what I've been seeing, there's questions for it. I have questions about it, so, yes.
So data aside, because apparently it's lifted up higher, to build on Cindy's point, it might be helpful though to have a conversation around, is the goal, are we looking to fill in gaps or lift up what is happening already, or like what's the best filter for making these decisions? I think we all used our own filter, which could be fine, but with a conversation of determining, well, maybe we really should look at where are the greatest gaps that no one's addressing, and we could really make an impact or not. I didn't have that conversation.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to suggest, in the interest of time, that we have a conversation about some of the other areas that were prioritized, because I think within the context of whatever areas we choose to work on, we can still have that. So even if we choose data-driven improvement, we can say, hey, there's work happening over here. We should really, I think there's there's deeper conversation that needs to be had once we identify where is most of our energy, where this group wants to go. So you want to?
I agree, yeah. So let's go to the next one. Let's to teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness. That one had the next highest votes for it.
So as a segue from there to there, is what do we have in the way of data that helps us look at teacher and administrator effectiveness, and how does that data help us drive a professional development agenda? So I think that those two things cross over in huge ways.
Say more about that.
So I'll be happy to speak on that. For teacher and administrator effectiveness, there are several initiatives that are already in place, and it goes back to the data because that's what is ultimately reported, whether it's test scores or census data, whatever, that's what is reported. And we know that we live in a world of social media, so everything that is reported out is in our face. With that being said, teacher and administrator effectiveness follows that data and is reported out through different avenues, such as their evaluations, the EBOS, that is the reports that go out for the schools for the student effectiveness, the growth rates that are produced through the end of grade test scores, starting with the beginning of year, the middle of year, the end of year. So all of that data is connected back to the teacher, which is ultimately connected back to the administrator in the school and the district. So all of that is out there, and I can just say from my experiences in working with teachers in a school system, and then I also teach distance ed classes at a university, teachers want to do the right thing. Administrators, I think, want to do the right thing. They just need to know what is what is the information that we all need to be communicating, and so that we're speaking that common language. And I think that is a need, from my perspective, and why I chose teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness, is because ultimately every area is being assessed and evaluated, but ultimately we're looking at that third grade, because that's where a lot of that publication of where we stand falls. It's either at the lower level or the third grade level. And so I feel like if the spotlight is going to be on the teachers and administrators at that level, they ultimately need to know what that is.
So I think that ties immediately back to the problems we're having with the data we already have. Everything that you're talking about ties into data that we are not so thrilled with in many ways. So it's like, what are some other things that we can do that support, that give information about what teachers and administrators need? I'm not saying those things aren't important, but I think they're convoluted. And so what are teacher and administrator practices? Like, let's look at what we know supports third grade outcomes. Oral language development, vocabulary development, scaffolded instruction, small group instruction. Get down to a level of what's happening for kids in the classroom. Emotional support, concept development. There's measures like crazy out there to look at all of those things. So I think that's a different level, and I think that certainly in my experience, talking to teachers about those things makes for changes in practice. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I want to echo that. Sharon, is that you've done really amazing work in expanding what is it that teachers have access to in terms of how children are doing and what do they do with that information, which is really important. I'm going to say something that might be considered heresy and say that I almost think we should take the word effectiveness off of this in some ways, because I think where in terms of preparation, right, to your point, how we measure teacher effectiveness, clearly we're not at the results we need, so teachers can be married to one. I think they do an amazing job. But it's sort of like that whole thing, the system creates the exact outcomes it's designed to create. So that's where I think the preparation piece is, there's so much research on what teachers and administrators, one, don't have and what they do need to produce the kinds of interactions we need with young children. And there's clearly huge distinctions between what birth to 5 teachers get in terms of preparation and administrators and what K through 3. And big disconnects. And so we already know by just looking at the preparation programs how we are not doing what we need to do to adequately prepare in either system. And I would imagine if we did that aligned with what is it we're trying to improve, we would get to effectiveness. But right now, the way we think about effectiveness is, I think, it's fine for it to be measured, in my opinion, it's fine to measure it on third grade outcomes. It's important as long as we've driven the whole process to support them getting there.
So just taking that up to a higher level for everyone. I mean, you are going down into it. But I mean, in the big picture, what I'm hearing is sort of there's 2 levels from all of you. One is there's the level of absolute outcomes for children, how children do on end of third grade, for example, end of third grade reading test. And then there's also growth of children, how children grow from where they start to where they end up, which is different than their absolute end score. So there's growth, there's absolute outcomes. And then you all are talking about, well, how does a teacher or administrator actually know that what they're doing is going to make a difference in those outcomes for children. How are we measuring that? Whether a teacher is effective, whether a teacher is doing things that is going to actually impact the child level outcomes, right? How do we measure that? And how do we adequately prepare for that? Is that correct?
I would emphasize on the preparation piece first, then how do we actually measure, is a teacher doing that? I think that the preparation piece is, we haven't started to give, so just as a concrete example.
I give Senator Lee a chance
I
to
just
jump
wanna ask
in.
a question. And Representative Horn I hope you'll correct me if I just get way off topic here or off base on the legislation. So just personally, when I considered the legislation and voted on it, there were two main components. One was a transition from pre-K to kindergarten, something something I feel is broken, for lots of different reasons. And the other component of the legislation was this vision. Get the experts around the table and establish a vision for birth to 3. And I think we do what a lot of groups do is we try and figure out, okay, let's build structure so we can establish a conversation about something that's very complicated. And everybody here is an expert. I'm not. So let's just get that out there. But it seems like we would not want to, if we were have a vision of transportation, we wouldn't say it has to have wheels, it has to have an engine. We would say, what is the best way to do something? And what the legislature has done here and said, when y'all come up with that vision, we just want to make sure so we can, evaluate how well it might work. We've got this criteria that we're kind of looking at. How's it going to work from a governance and funding perspective? Or do you have some components here that talk about how you're educating, your teachers, and how is that going to dovetail into family engagement, some of those other things? And I think we're falling into a trap by saying that we're looking at the pieces before we can envision what we want. So I personally, and I say this all the time, because it's true, I'm not an expert at any of this stuff. So to get the experts around the table and say, what Kevin said earlier, we've been doing this thing for 20 years. Let's take a step back and say, what's the vision? What would it really look like? How would we integrate early childhood care with education? And because it's all intertwined together. How do we bring in the concept of the ACES program? Not how are we doing it today and how we can fit it into the pre-K program we have, but what's the best way to do it? That's what I thought we were doing. But am I wrong?
No, you're right. From our standpoint, that's exactly what I had in mind when we wrote this legislation. My concern was, I hear all the time that we've got more and more kids coming into kindergarten that aren't prepared for kindergarten, aren't prepared for first grade. Okay, so what are we gonna do about it? I hear all the time about the 30 million word gap. Okay, so what are we gonna do about it? Getting into the weeds of how all that works, that's not our world. Our world is funding it, assessing it,
Selling
and
selling it to the people.
that's right, and getting 61 members of the House and 26 members of the Senate to agree on, okay, what are we gonna do? And that's the vision. How do we make all our desire, and that's where I put most of my dots in transition and continuity, how do we get all this effort to work together? You guys are the experts on the details. I don't know how many wheels should be on the truck. I don't know any of that. It's been a long time since there's been small children in my life. My youngest grandchild's 18 years old. So I'm looking as a legislator, I'm looking to you all for how do we bring this all together for a smooth transition from birth through age 8 to accomplish a few simple goals, not so simple. Now, simple but not easy. Simple goals are, as I said last time, get a child out of 8 that's healthy with a good attitude and can read. Okay. How does that, what's the seamless transition? How much money is it gonna take? Where do we put our focus? And how do we know that whatever we come up with is successful? What are the accountability measures?
And
Can I
I,
just add another
yeah.
thing? So we have, and let's just talk about the Medicaid population. Medicaid, or special needs, or whenever you have these additional supports, you've got this, and I talk about this not in the context of B3, but in the context of just general K-12, because I've thought about it in that context. You have a funding stream here from Medicaid, and you've got, K-12 funding, and it's rare that they actually intersect within the school system setting. So I may have a child that's getting, let's say, speech within the school system, and is also getting paid for by the school system. They're also getting speech through Medicaid, and I've had instances where you just can't get the speech therapist to talk, and there's not a lot of coordination. So the concept for me personally, B3 is part of it, but getting the two touch points, and there are other touch points, and I talked about this maybe in the last meeting, and I'll beat it to death, is that you have all these touch points with state government, and you've got to go to every single department to have those touch points. How do you have an integrated support system for children on B3? Because education, all these other things that y'all are the experts that have talked about, have such a dramatic impact on success in education. How do we get those to work together from birth? So if you brainstorm a solution, you may say, we need to have every child needs an individual citizen advocate, and you may come up with a $100 gazillion solution. And then what you do is, well, how can we accomplish some of the same things on economies of scales, and we're still meeting these? Those are where I want to see us
So
go.
Nancy, and then I
I was
have
just
you.
gonna say, truth be known, when More at 4 started, my first thought was, oh my gosh, someday we're gonna be trying to figure out how to get kids ready for what is now NC pre-K. So what we essentially have is two systems, and the legislature, in my mind, said, hey, wait a minute, we're beginning to understand this brain stuff, and we're beginning to see that the 0 to 5 matters. How do we get those two systems to work together? And they are distinctly different, and one is okay and the other is not okay. You guess which one which is which. All I'm saying to you is they don't work together, and the legislature wants to figure out how to work together. And the truth is, if I were to come out with my plan, the next question would be, how in the world are you going to pay for it? Which is what he's saying. You can design a system, but it costs $1 gazillion, and we don't have that. But I really think it's appropriate for us to listen to what they're saying, that in fact, we got two distinct systems, and they are not meshed, and they almost compete against each other.
So I
That's
think
not
it's
good.
important to figure out where all those pieces lie.
Right.
And to develop that map. I mean, we need a map with all those pieces, who's doing what, and what their outcomes are. And we need to line that. I mean, this is just it's creating that coordinate. You can't coordinate a system if you don't have the pieces in front of you to coordinate.
But we have to be careful to not get so much in the weeds,
Which is what, yes.
which is what I think they're trying to tell
Yeah,
us.
well, yes, exactly, which is what was actually
We're
going
real
on.
good at that.
Yeah.
So
It's not that we don't want to be at the classroom level, or
Right.
that, it's not that we don't understand that, but if we do not create a coordinated system of care, if we do not have accountability for that system, and we don't know where all the pieces lie, and how they're all working, we can't create the bridge for them to work together if we don't have that.
But let me say one more thing. Parents and adults who work with children are very significant in the lives of children. Truth be known, in a way, public education is suffering from an attitude that's over half a century old, when they said to parents, you let us teach, you go home and just care. and I'm not kidding, if you read the literature, there was a pattern which was a bit arrogant that said teachers teach and parents parent, and the two don't work together, right? And it has now backfired. There's a lot of criticism about it, but nobody ever really stops to think about where it came from. The teachers who work with children, whether they're 0 or 8, matter in the lives of children, and the adults matter. So some of the data we are all trying to use child data to assess adults, it doesn't work that way.
So I
The truth
think
is, we gotta focus on adults.
what I'm hearing in this conversation, very, very, very helpful to think about at what level of work are we doing and what level of conversation we're having. And it looks like the third highest vote getter actually was transitions and continuity. But, so imagine if the way we approached our work was saying, okay, we're gonna focus on a vision for transition and continuity. What would that look like? And I think, Senator Lee went to a place of every family had an advocate. I mean, but I think that was the right kind of way of kind of reaching, which is to say, and to Pam's point, if the purpose of this council was to say, what does success look like if we have a truly birth through age 8 aligned system? How do we know that we've been successful? So that does get back actually to data-driven, it gets back to outcomes and accountability. So if we had a vision for transitions and continuity, what would that vision be? And what would be the outcomes for that, and then what would be sort of the top places we would want to focus on transition and continuity, whether it's for a child or whether it's for the family or whether it's across teaching standards and practices and how we're measuring it. So if the frame is really around transitions and continuity as sort of the priority, then the place we would start is what is a vision for transition and continuity. Really, the two we would be choosing, in a sense, are transition and continuity and data-driven improvement, recognizing that where we might end up going in deeper work would be around transitions and continuity related to what a child and family has experienced, so family engagement, or transitions and continuity related to teacher and administrator preparation, and what that looks like, right? Does that make sense? That the frame is really, that's what I hear like you're saying. The frame is really what is the vision for a birth to age 8 system that has good transition and continuity, and how do we know that how would we measure that we were successful in getting there? Is that what I'm hearing?
And then I think that I pulled up the legislation, you've got this one bullet, the development implementation of a statewide vision for early childhood education, and the development and implementation of a program for transitioning children from preschool to kindergarten.
Yeah.
That latter piece is something that is relatively low-hanging fruit, I would think, because we realize we have some issues now with transition, and the vision is more of a longer term.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing a lot of work on that right now.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not.
No. But I think that could be brought back to the council, the work, if that's something we bring back to the council and explain the work that's going on, and then where do we want to go from there?
There's just a report from this committee in a month, so I'm just thinking there might be some easy ways to have some forward movement to report, since we only have 30 days left, that first report. So anyway, just my 2 cents.
Tracy?
I like the way that you frame that. I think that's really helpful way to think about it. And to your point about the report, there's some things, we're not operating like in a vacuum. There's some, I think, exciting things happening around the state in some districts around this very issue. And whether that's through work that's happening as part of our, I'm not going to leave you, I promise, Every Student Succeeds Act, and looking at birth to 8, which some districts are really looking at pretty significantly, including yours, and specifically focusing on transitions. So that may be a start, rather than, the prospect of mapping a whole system is daunting, frankly.
I think it's needed, though. How do you not map a system when you know where things are coming from? We know where the federal and the state money comes from. We know what's being funded. We know the groups that pretty much get the funding. So how do you not map the system to try to figure that out? I mean, that, I just don't.
You mean the funding sources when you
Well,
say
no,
that?
I mean, the system as a whole. There's certain things that drive our system. So how do we not, if there's supposed to be an alignment, if we're talking about an alignment, how do we align it if we don't look at the pieces that we need to
I'm
align?
not, yes, I'm
So
not
that's-
disputing that. I think, I like the idea though of starting with the vision and where we wanna go, because if, I just worry if we start by mapping, we'll just wanna move the pieces around. Just my.
So
I
starting
didn't
with.
mean to hijack
division.
y'all's.
No, I think that's really helpful.
Oh, sure.
Take a 10-minute break and then we'll regroup and think about where.
Yeah, I think, let's do that. Let's take a couple-minute break. If anybody has questions about the travel forms, or if you didn't get one and you need one, Mary, raise your hand. Go see Mary, or if you have any questions, she's the one to contact. So we'll take a 10-minute break.
10-minute
How's that
break
sound?
and we'll come back and.
Who is the person taking yours?
Probably one of the two people sitting back there.
That is this.
Just
Jay
take that.
Bird.
Think about some.
Yeah, we've got another.
Like a bell. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, we're gonna get started again. Good morning, we're gonna get started. Second part, thank you.
Come back, everybody. Come back to us. Thank you, Representative Horn. We need a little bell. Okay.
My fingers, but I can't do it.
Okay. Okay.
Got everybody back?
Yeah, Pam and I have had a chance to really regroup and really appreciate the level of discussion we had prior to the break, and we think that it demonstrates some of the tension between holding the bigger vision and people who are ready to kind of dig into the deeper work. And kind of figuring out at what level of work is this council going to engage appropriately, and what can we accomplish. And so what we want to do is break people down into two different groups.
Yeah, the transition and continuity, and then teacher and administrator preparedness and effectiveness.
And for transitions and continuity, so we want to have kind of two levels of conversation because there seems to be different energy in both. So in transition and continuity, to Senator Lee's point, we thought we want to spend about 20 minutes having you think from the perspective of a parent, I'm going to say parent in this case, a parent or a family and a baby. From the time a baby is born with that parent, what would you hope for in terms of how that family and child would experience continuity beginning from when the child was not in any kind of formal education setting at all, to moving to a formal early childhood education experience, to moving into pre-K, to moving into kindergarten through third grade. So what would your vision be for what kind of supports, information, experience that child and family would have? Big level, what would your wishes be? So we're going to have one group that wants to spend some energy on that, really thinking, wow, in an ideal world, this is what a child and family would experience and the kinds of supports they would have. And then for the group that focuses on teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness, we were thinking, okay, from the perspective of teachers and administrators, what would continuity and transition look like for them? What would they experience? What would be similar and different across the birth to 5 and K-3 continuum? So what would teachers and administrators experience would be the other group Does that make sense? This is really just sort of to start to get at a sense of vision, and then we'll craft it after that. We think we'll probably get out a little bit early today, but we want to spend about 20 minutes in small groups of your choosing, the one that you feel the most energy around, having that conversation. Then we'll come back and have a full group discussion.
Yeah.
So maybe over on this side, we'll do teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness, and this side of the room, if you'll huddle and do
Transitions and continuity, yeah.
go.
Right. 20 minutes.
This side is teacher.
Yeah.
So we don't self-select.
Wait, do you want us
You
to
self-select.
self-select.
Yeah,
No,
self-select.
choosing.
This side is teacher and
So
administrator.
you can go to whatever
You
side.
can go to whatever side you want.
I'm just saying.
This side is transition and
He gets
continuity.
born.
Well,
Pre-K to K.
Moms and
yes.
daddies. This is baby gets born.
Yeah, but
What
it's not
happens?
just
Oh, well, yeah, but
not if I'm
in the
staying
family,
here anyway.
in the family though, in the, what happens?
You have to get over on that side. That's
Oh, no, I'm school. That's what
I thought this was teacher.
this is teacher and administrator preparation and effectiveness.
Transition.
It's what
This
happens
is-
all the way through.
Transition and continuity. What a family and a child experiences from birth through third grade at all the transition points, from when they're born to when they transition
Sorry, I
into early
misunderstood.
childhood. Okay.
Are you in the right group?
I am that.
Yeah.
Nobody else looked like they were getting out their paper.
I'm so glad that they.
So you're gonna
Yeah,
record?
no, I like it. It's good.
Yes. Pick somebody who's going to do a report out.
Talks about what a teacher administrator would experience. Guess I
Sturdy
want to
lady.
say, what about the preparation that start with, do we say they start with a certain level of preparation, or where does preparation come into that?
Answer it however I would like. You can interpret.
So in my mind, we have
I
two
would not
things.
say it was
Yeah,
somebody
that
from
would-
the
right,
state.
I would
Integrate
pick
parent
Social
talks about
Security,
higher education. So to me, that's the teachers that are coming out.
You're saying for
to us
your
as
own
new
personal
teachers.
Yeah, whenever we had children.
Okay, so you're
Social
actually.
Security was there, we had to fill it out.
Okay.
Had to,
Oh, you're saying that's a
Classroom
okay.
homework,
It's an
but
intro.
also
yeah, I'm just
our
saying,
teachers.
where's the
I
entry
see,
point?
I
If you-
see.
And really any
It's
staff,
so
because everybody
hard
has an
for-
active role in their schools of what to do.
Yeah, they're very overwhelmed.
And children as they're
So
transitioning.
this is actually, the question she's asking is actually a
Custodian is
vision
that
for
Started to
that
say
makes that
every person,
connection.
every adult in that building.
parents.
Right, but,
Matters.
but I mean, I know we
Yeah,
have
but
to
as
have
a
a starting
community
point,
agency,
so
we're
ultimately.
To answer those questions, support them as parents.
Go ahead.
What I'm talking
And
about. Let me start with, I don't know what I'm
know
talking
that new
about.
moms and that, when you're in the
Educator.
hospital, they're overwhelmed, they get every pamphlet,
Childcare provider,
and all of that gets
Grand
chucked in the trash. So at what
I don't have to
point,
worry about
here soon after,
getting
can we,
26 members of the Senate.
and
Those well
share
baby
knowledge.
visits and literacy stuff has been
think-
very.
When I first started
That's
doing
where they
this,
go.
I do think that you stop by and say,
Yeah,
in the
absolutely,
hospital, hey, I'm
absolutely.
so-and-so, we're,
didn't seem to me
because that's when you're gonna,
But-
his name's not,
doing early
they
ed,
make that decision.
before pre-K, before K,
but who's
elders with what we were doing after.
so that community
So,
agency like mine,
talk about
that might be very big community.
teachers in the
So what is it?
K-3 area. What are we doing about preparing teachers in the, before they get to the K-3? And are they both focused on the same goals?
Receive me as
They're both focused on the same goals.
something like that.
No, what are the goals?
Not to
They
receive
should
me
both be
as-
focused.
So if you're, when I think about that, and I think of your point about a higher level,
Questions along the way, that's where we should barely getting.
you're welcome. So this is vision, not necessarily like,
Nutrition.
what I'm gonna say, the practicalities will be most like for childcare.
But does it start before
So
birth?
I see two things.
pediatrician, yeah.
So when your pediatrician is seeing you, hey, by the way, so
A 0 to 8 teacher preparation approach.
That's a, that's psychology, obstetrician, it's not
The same.
before,
And I would also see in terms of transitions, wouldn't it be
and then there's follow-up, nutrition side.
teachers, again,
Yep.
birth to
They
8,
get
so
a
you had
pediatrician.
your elementary school,
Kids are college age,
for your
but
K
the
through 3, and the feeder childcare programs that tend to feed into that school. If they had their own,
yeah.
yeah,
But I don't
Sure.
remember a conversation. team that.
Well, but yeah, I don't, I
So you
mean,
had
I think we're
in the
talking
prep, and then you
huge
had
education campaign
your
here,
0
right,
to
for
8
medical
teachers
services.
doing
Yeah.
that
So
kind
I
of
think that,
ongoing.
And
To your seats.
solve the world's problems in 2 minutes.
I don't even need to meet again, I think we're just saying.
Our work is done.
Your work is done.
Yep,
We'd
it's
like
good.
somebody from each one of your groups to kind of report out what you all were, kind of summarize what you're talking about and what your thoughts were.
Yes, in our group, we decided we need to turn the heat up in here.
Okay.
I've got my coat
in here.
Okay.
I know we all have our coats on.
So I'm on the family support
Yes.
side, and I'm gonna ask my folks to chime in when I
That's not what we're
accidentally skip
calling
over
this.
something. So, so
Transitions and.
what we were asked to discuss is that when a child is born, what is that family or child's experience as they kind of go through, move through kindergarten, grade 3, what's happening with the family. Gosh, we could have talked about so much more, but we know when babies are born, parents are just flooded with information. They're in the hospital or at the place of birth, but we felt like that information was important. So, where do all parents usually end up with some sort of medical provider? And so how you use that as an access point so that every county has a county-specific sort of a parent toolkit. Because all counties have resources. Some of them are county-specific, some of them are statewide. But giving parents the tools to know how to access information along the journey of parenting their child. So what services and help are available, both government and non-government in their communities. But beyond that, having access to in their community, what did we call it? A parenting navigator? Yeah. So if I don't have transportation to XYZ resource, how do I get that? And where that person exists in a community can probably change based on the community.
Right.
But basically having parents be able to access information where they need it kind of in a centralized place and location. We also talked about in that process or in that toolkit would be very important to talk to parents about the importance of early childhood education, how to identify quality education, how to find it, where it is in their community, but then also and I'm building here, but we talked a little bit about for the parent who is at home, the child, where one of the parents is at home with a child or a grandmother or another adult caregiver. How do we support them so that they are aware of what this child needs to be growing and developing optimally? And then we knew what they were talking about there, and here at the table we are all very aware that we spend a lot of time talking about how ill-prepared our early childhood educators are, maybe compared to the K through 12 the level of support and education that they get. But at the same time, we know that in early childhood that we're well versed in what's developmentally appropriate practices and methods for young children, and felt like, okay, we're experts here and we need to push that up because our K through 3 teachers need to know that as well. And so it's 2 different styles of teaching a child. And so how we unite, you're going to give me the words, how we unite the best of both systems for that sort of seamless transition. And then there are lots of activities that preschools and schools can do together to help transition physically a child from one learning environment to another, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Were you guys talking more at the community level or at a statewide? Like, so if a parent moves from one community to,
Yeah,
across
they would be
the
able to
state,
find that same toolkit in early childhood about what's available, but it's specific to that community.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So parents would know where to go and recognize it,
Okay,
depending,
yep.
no matter where they end up
Yep.
throughout the state of North Carolina.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Guys, who's gonna report out?
Alrighty, so our task was to look at teachers and administrators and what they would experience for continuity of a
transitions in a system. And so we started by saying we would get rid of the distinction of saying K through 3, and we would just have a birth to 8 early learning, early learning, and then
talked about that.
kids could go into 4th grade.
That too.
So we're starting with and that teachers and administrators would know that they were part of this early learning system, of which they would be part of a B to 8 teacher preparation program, whatever that might look like, where they had a common set of core curriculum. There was definitely some discrepancy over how many years different teachers needed what, but there was a common set of core curriculum to that. That the license would belong to the teacher regardless. Right now, as a distinction for folks, if you're in birth through 5, the license is with the provider. If you're in K through 3, the license is with the teacher. So we would
You mean the program, the license in birth to 5 is with the
program. I said
program.
provider. Yeah, program. I meant, yes. And that you would, as part of this system of transition, you would be licensed, not, it would be based on you. And that as part of this, the setting wouldn't determine your level of knowledge. So whether you were in a child care program or a public school or what have you.
Okay, so far, we're blowing up the K-12 system entirely. We're creating a parent navigator for every child born in North Carolina. I like thinking small, thinking small. Okay, so I think what Pam and I were brainstorming while we were doing a little regrouping. One question we have before we move on to sort of the next meeting and next steps would be, as you're thinking about a vision for transition and continuity, and what would be measures of success, what else would you want us to bring to this group? What else do you want to know? Are there particular pieces of the system you want to understand better, data that you want to have? What else can we bring forward to you that is going to help you make better decisions about what outcomes we would select and what vision we would develop, and then the strategies we would create underneath them?
I think it would be helpful to me to know what all the funding streams are, and how much. What's the big bottom dollar line we're spending on early childhood in North Carolina? How did all those come to be? I imagine it'll look like a plate of spaghetti. You remember that at Emerging Institutes where she threw up the plate of spaghetti but all those funding streams got developed for some reason, which may be perfectly valid and good reasons, but there may be, if we looked at it all, ways we can make things make better sense or more easily understood.
And I agree with her. And in addition to that, what does each one of those groups represent, and what do they bring to the table?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's obviously things that are already in place that we could build on.
Yeah.
Could you say more about what you mean by that?
For example, like if funding is going to Smart Start, what are the roles and responsibilities of Smart Start? What do they do?
Mm-hmm.
If funding is going to Head Start or the public schools, what is each group's roles in this process? Not anything in depth, but just a general, what's everybody doing that we can make it all fit together?
To get a holistic picture,
Yes.
I'm assuming. Okay.
I would just like us to try and think differently. So if we come into this meeting and someone says, well, what are y'all talking about? We say, well, we want to add a navigator for every child in North Carolina. At first blush, that sounds really crazy. But there is already a navigator for every single child in North Carolina. It's just in 10 different places.
Right.
So while this sounds like an additional big, bump, it actually already exists, and we're making a system incredibly efficient by having one person who's an expert as to how to get people to the right place. The analogy is to a mental health navigation pilot that we worked on, where you have one number to call, regardless of payer, And that person that picks up the phone gets you to the resource that you need to get to because it's impossible to figure out for a layperson. And even some mental health providers, they don't know, they don't even know who exists in their own communities in many instances. I think the same thing goes on. So I just want to encourage us to think a little differently when it comes to those things.
So, I mean, you have that model in, say, a United Way 211 already that's serving us across the state, but also we are a recipient of a grant from DHHS for our Incredible Years program, and that was a requirement of Incredible Years Circles of Parents that we have no, it wasn't, community response program through DSS, that we have a community response resource guide developed for every family we serve, and we just threw it up on our website, but it's there. You're right, it exists, so it's not so crazy. And
But to know that it even exists, maybe other parts of the
Other
system
people
don't
just
even know that.
Right.
Even what,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, Sharon?
So I'd actually like to bring something, rather than ask you to find it, is that we have years of North Carolina data of what the minute-by-minute experiences of North Carolina pre-K through children look like in classrooms. And I think that seeing that data will inform some of the discussions around evidence-based practices that happen in classrooms and the developmental continuum of the difference of experiences of pre-K kids and K3 kids. So I just think it would inform the discussion, so I'd like to be able to talk about that.
Great.
Thank you.
If there's any already best or examples of this kind of innovation that others have, so you're not recreating the wheel, even if they're in different systems, particularly around the parent navigator piece, but it would be helpful to know, and whether that's locally, there are certainly things happening in some districts around transition and continuity, or whether that's in other states, or what, it'd be good to have some models to think about.
Yeah, and I'll say I brought up 211, which is I'm calling, I'm taking care of it, versus the program that we do. I have a point person who then helps that parent kind of navigate that information. And so that's what I think, that human connection of, this is how it works in this county. This is what's available and what's not.
How do we know when a child is ready for fourth grade? Just because they passed third grade?
What is that?
That EOG.
Depends on who you ask. Right.
So what is the expectation a fourth grade teacher has for when they walk in the room on the first day of class, fourth grade? What is the expectation that teacher has for where those children are? Now, I don't know the answer to that. All I'm suggesting is that that's part of the definition or the accountability measure for that early ed part. Are they ready for fourth grade? Because by that time, we expect them to be able to read. What else do we expect of them?
Well, I think there is some expectation, just based in that there are standards that are aligned for, and I might not be using the right term, so if someone else who's back there has the right term, but teachers have a set of, I'm not sure if it's standards is the right word, that they're supposed to meet, what?
The standard course of study.
Yeah, that they're supposed to meet for each
Right, standard
child.
course of study.
And that's where children are supposed to be at the end of the year. And the fourth grade teacher, I think, expectation is that that child is at least proficient in that, has been able to master that course of study to some degree, and is ready to move on to the next course of study. And it's outlined, so.
Is that shared all the way down? All the way down to,
That's where I think we get into the alignment issues.
Exactly.
I don't know. I
and
couldn't
that's
speak to that.
my point.
That information.
If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
But I think there's also the other part of that, because that's content.
Right,
And
yes.
what we're expecting them to master. But I think if you ask a fourth grade teacher what they want, kids who can function independently and collaboratively, kids who can persist and will not give up, kids who are self-regulated and able to inhibit some of their impulses and manage their emotions. I mean, those are things that fourth grade teachers expect and need and are at a loss for if the kids don't come to them. So, you know, and I think there's where all the brain research, executive function, and I think that that suggests that those kinds of things have to become part of the curriculum. Like, you have to teach that stuff. You can't assume that it will happen. And so I think that's that backward mapping. And
So-
then I
You're
think
right.
they have a
That's
better
a much
chance to
better way to
actually
phrase it.
master content.
Okay, so
What
the
business
question
people
on the
want to.
table was, what else do we need
We
to
are
know?
who we
So
are.
do we want to know more about what we know about the standard course of study and expectations at fourth grade and how that maps backwards?
I think that might be interesting. Even those of us who are in education may need to revisit it briefly.
Okay, at a
Well-
high
So-
level,
What?
at a high level.
I wonder about that. So, because I'm processing what Sharon said and thinking about your setting of the table of keeping things at, as you said, at a high level and how easy it will get mired down into the course of study, which is long and has lots of things that don't necessarily speak to what Sharon has raised, which I think when we think about the system, are key, are the skills and attributes you need to be building. So I just caution
I
about.
think Pam and I can think about
Yeah.
what would be an appropriate, not to like go over the entire standard course
Right,
of
yeah, we
study.
don't
I
need
don't
to
think
do
that would be a
that.
good plan.
When kids come to kindergarten, we have the social emotional piece that we're measuring along with the academic, but in fourth grade, we have the academic.
Right.
So I think maybe there might be the missing link of the social emotional for fourth grade, and so the behavioral. So we're measuring it on the kindergarten level, but not the fourth grade level.
I will just say from personal experience, I know we don't want to keep going down into this rabbit hole, but when I taught at UNCC, and I was supposed to teach, I taught preschool, early childhood language and literacy, I always went up to third grade. Why did I teach up to third grade? Was because they needed to understand the skills that a child needs to learn in third grade doesn't start in third grade. It doesn't start in second, first, or kindergarten. It starts from the very beginning. When you start developing language, you start developing experiences so they can actually have other conceptual understandings when they are reading. So there's that building block, and you would see this aha from students when you're like, if you don't start working on this and you don't have these type of activities in your classroom, guess what? This is what they need in second and third grade to understand these concepts. So I think, I think, and I may be misinterpreting what you said, but that's what when I think of backwards mapping, it's trying for our early childhood community and our teachers and our providers to understand that those concepts are they're not, we always say the stepping stones, the building blocks, but really where do they map to in the future? And when you see that patterns map to multiplication, that map to other, things, then all of a sudden there's the aha moments and they understand what they really should be doing in the classroom. Not just, these are the things that are important for you to do, but why and how it plays out 2, 3, 5, 10 years later. So I think, that's just, don't want to get too far into it, but I do think that's a thought, that's something to think about, when we eventually get into, maybe other things, so.
Absolutely.
This is a
Okay.
piece of data I
Yeah.
think that might be helpful to us, Susan, is if we could find the number of children who are in the number of children that are in a pre-K program or a high-quality early childhood program before they enter kindergarten. That would be helpful to know because we're talking so much about all the systems that influence children in care. And I think that an aha might be that that's not where most of our children are before they enter kindergarten.
Exactly.
And so I don't want to derail our conversation, but that might help influence
Yes.
another conversation. So just the
It's a big part of this
data.
family
We
conversation.
can bring the pathways data that speaks
Yes.
to
Mhm.
that
Okay.
and many other things. So
So-
one would be the experiences, and we can bring the pathways data, which would show you where children are.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay, so far we would like to have a little bit more information about high-level funding streams and amounts, the broad system as it currently exists, sort of roles and responsibilities. Sharon would like to share data on what children actually experience in our pre-K through Okay,
Third.
third grades,
But
settings.
whatever you, if I can do it anyway.
Okay,
that's
on a,
fine.
but on a daily basis, sort of at a high level. We'd like to look at examples of innovations in the transitions and continuity space. We'd like a little bit more at a very high level of what the expectations are for children at fourth grade, mapping backwards. And a little bit of an overview of where are kids and in the course of their life, how many of them are in preschool. And some of that we can get from the Pathways data.
And we should also be able to provide you, at the next meeting with where the pre-K to K transitioning is going, and, or give you an update on what's going on with that as well. Because there are work groups going on right now that are working in that.
So for next meeting, we'll start to maybe bring back some of that data and information in a easily digestible way. We will give you an update on the pre-K to K transition work that's happening now. And we also, Pam and I talked that we will take a shot at some vision statements around this work and some draft high-level outcomes that we might want to see, so that we can have a starting place rather than start from scratch. Totally up for discussion and changing, but at least we'll have something on paper for you all to react to, and that will give us at least a better sense of what is our vision, what are we trying to achieve, and then we can back into the work.
Sound good? All right. Well, we're gonna, anything else before we close the meeting?
Thank
Are we
you.
gonna identify, when are we meeting?
We're gonna send out a doodle poll,
Oh,
and
okay.
then we will, so it'll be in, what are we on, March, May. May will be at the next meeting.
So the report that's due in April, who's doing that?
We'll both be working on that.
Will you
Say
share
we
it with
have
us?
convened. We will hopefully have a vision by then and some other things, but we'll certainly share the
Yes.
draft of the report with you all as we prepare that. But the next meeting will be in May, and I think what we talked about was actually going ahead and scheduling meetings
In the, yeah.
further out so that we can get them on people's calendars and you all know when they're.
All right.
Anything else?
All right.
Closing thoughts?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
If you need
Thanks
me.
for coming in.
Remember she said this about that.
All right.
See you at the next meeting.
I am too. Good news is I heard it's.
Oh, yes.